All right, everyone. So we're going to start the formal part of our conversation here today now. So to get us started, the important thing is to think about what it means to be an employee overall, and the fact that being an employee remotely is really no different than being an employee in person. So if you approach it with that kind of mindset, you're really setting yourself up for success. So again, the main idea here, basically behave and perform as you would for an on-site internship or job. We really want to treat it the same sort of way. Everything that we're going to talk to you about today aligns to this concept. Now, there's some differences, and we're going to highlight those as well. But a lot of the big concepts, the main ideas, will help you transition to in-person work dynamics or any work dynamic that you might face going forward as well. So your focus while working as a remote employee is to really imitate an office work environment to the best of your ability. So this means that you should focus on a few things. We're going to talk about these in more detail as we go through our presentation. You should be building connections with your team members, with your supervisor, with your colleagues. You should follow your work schedule. It's going to be very important for you. You should be focused on meeting company and supervisor expectations. You need to stay focused and organized. We're going to give you some strategies around that as well. Again, you want to complete high quality work just as you would in person, and you're going to work and behave as if you're in the office with your supervisor nearby. You want to do the same kinds of things, have the same integrity, honesty, work ethic, strong output that you would have at any other setting. Even though this is remotely, you're going to keep doing that same thing. So one of the most important things to understand going into this dynamic is to understand your work day and your work hour expectations. So we're going to talk about core business hour expectations. Many companies will have core business hour expectations, meaning they expect employees to be available from a certain time in the morning through a certain time in the afternoon or evening. Those are going to be the core hours in which your work schedule needs to be structured around. So it's going to be important for you to understand if that applies to your company, and if so, what does that mean for you? In addition to that, it's going to be important for you to understand if your position is exempt or non-exempt. So what we're talking about here is essentially, is your position hourly and therefore potentially eligible for overtime, or are you in a salaried position? If you're getting ready to take on an internship, more often than not, those are going to be hourly positions where you'll be expected to work a certain number of hours per day and a certain number of hours per week. For many of you, this will apply to your full-time position as well. So this is a really important thing for you to understand, because for hourly positions, more often than not, you are going to need to log or report your hours worked in some way. That could be structured in a variety of ways depending upon the company, but it's important for you to know, do you need to log your hours or report your hours worked? And if so, how? What is the system? What is the process? What are the expectations around that? If you are eligible for overtime, again, that's something you need to know. Are you eligible for overtime? Are you not? And what does that mean for the company? If you are eligible for overtime, meaning a different rate of pay, if you exceed the expected hours of work for your position, typically that's more than 40 hours a week if you enter into that territory, then you likely will need supervisor approval, which is important for you to understand, because you as the employee do not get to determine if you are going to work overtime. It's your supervisor in the company determines if you are approved to work overtime. And so that's very important for you to know. As an hourly employee or someone who is overtime eligible or expected to work within a core time period, it's important for you to understand if you are able to work beyond those hours or not. That has to do with labor standards and things of that nature as well. If you're in a salaried position, oftentimes that means that you are in a position where you're being paid for the work that you're doing tied with a particular role. And so some weeks that may exceed 40 hours per week. Your pay does not change in that case. This most often applies to full-time positions. Not all full-time positions, some full-time positions. So again, whether you're an intern or full-time, it's important for you to understand, are you an hourly employee? Are you a salaried employee? Are you exempt from overtime? Are you non-exempt? And if so, for any of those things, what does that mean for your work hour expectations and how you go about documenting that? There's also some important things to keep in mind about expected availability. You need to know and follow the appropriate and expected work schedule and hours for your team, for your position, and for your company. You will not get to dictate what hours you want to work in a given day. It doesn't matter if you're not a morning person or you are a morning person or you like to work late at night. That's not about your preferences. At this point, it's about what the company expects of you. So knowing that expected availability, when you should be working, when you should be available, is very, very important. So understand those company and manager expectations, confirm your schedule with your manager, and make sure you're following that in order to be in the right kind of power dynamics for your organization and to be an effective employee.
All right, thank you, Marcy. Now let's discuss a little bit, like Marcy said, so we've been working on setting our schedule and making sure that we are working the appropriate number of hours and during the right hours of the day for the company. But let's talk a little bit about managing your time within those set schedules. So it's really important, I think, especially as a remote employee, it becomes a little bit more difficult to manage your time and really make sure that you're staying on track and being productive and efficient on your own, as you're not in that office environment where you might have team members or supervisors nearby. So it's really important to come up with a set schedule and kind of manage your own time. And there are many different ways and kind of tips that we'll cover in order to do so. So I think first and foremost, it's super important to really understand the project scope and certain deadlines that you might be working against. And if that's not clear to you, please feel free to verify that with a manager or a supervisor. If they're giving you a project or giving you something to work on, it's always great to ask, when do you expect this to be done by? When would you like me to get this to you? Do you want progress updates as I'm working on it, etc. So that you really kind of understand that scope and the deadlines that you're working against so you can manage your time appropriately. I find it really beneficial to break those work assignments down into manageable and realistic steps and goals and deadlines for yourself. So maybe it's a project that they want you to work on for the next month. If you take that month-long project and set kind of weekly goals that you want to hit while working on that project, it can be helpful to keep you on track so that you complete everything in time and just keep you on a set schedule so that you're not overwhelmed after 3 weeks of not doing much when it comes down to you have 1 week left and there's 3 weeks worth of work to do. So it really is going to help yourself and, you know, make sure to help your team and things as well. So next we have following through on those commitments and deadlines. So like I just said, if you're setting those smaller goals for yourself and maybe setting weekly or daily to-do lists, etc., it can be really helpful because if for some reason you would come to a roadblock or there's something you don't understand and you need some additional clarification on, you're not waiting until the last minute to ask your supervisor or a teammate to help you move through that. You've kind of buffered in enough time to get past this roadblock, have a better understanding, and still be able to deliver that project on time. So I really strongly believe in setting smaller goals. Everything seems less daunting when you're doing that too. If you're breaking it down into those really manageable steps, it becomes a lot clearer of the steps that you need to take to get to that end project and to do it in the appropriate amount of time. Now, it's just as important on your calendar to schedule breaks for yourself too. I think it especially can be easy when you are working remotely to really sit down at your desk and just put your head down and work hard throughout the day. But for your mental health and your just well-being in general, you want to make sure that you're scheduling appropriate breaks on your calendar as needed too. But let's make sure that they are also appropriate and timely. So we don't want to block off too much time on our calendar or time on our calendar that a supervisor or teammates might want to use to work on other things at that time. So a lunch break, for example, is an appropriate break to put on your calendar. I have found it really beneficial, even just during these last few months of working remotely, to schedule a lunch break to really, of course, take time to eat because that's important, but also just to take a mental break away from your laptop, whether that's picking up a book or going for a walk around your neighborhood, etc. It's helpful and it just kind of rejuvenates you to then take on the rest of the afternoon and get remotivated to do some additional work. I think what we're saying here for all of this is that kind of helping to develop a routine and make a schedule for yourself, it starts to feel more normal, especially even if you're doing it in, working remotely in your own home or own apartment. Kind of creating that schedule makes it still feel like a normal work environment. I find that to-do lists can be really, really helpful. Like I said, you're putting kind of those more smaller, manageable tasks on that to-do list, and who doesn't love checking things off of a to-do list? You feel just so accomplished. At least I do. I find weekly to-do lists to be really helpful. I know people who do daily to-do lists, but it's just great to kind of even look back and see what you've accomplished and what you need to do for the following week as well. Next up, so now that we're managing our time and our calendars and our schedules appropriately, it's also really important while working remotely to find a space and set up a true workspace. It really helps you present yourself professionally to your colleagues and things of that nature through video chats and such, which we'll talk about further. But it also, I think, just mentally helps you kind of create a barrier between what is work and what is the rest of your house, apartment, bedroom, etc. I know it can be difficult because some of you might be working remotely with family or even with roommates and things of that nature. But if possible, even just finding a small corner of a room or your bedroom to designate a specific work area with a table, a desk, a chair, that, like I said, it just kind of creates what is a work setting and what is the rest of your house and normal living areas. So we definitely want you to designate that space. I find it helps even just keeping myself organized. All the things that I need for work, my chargers, my laptop, notes and things that I've taken are all in one place as well. And then we want to make sure, along with that workspace, let's make sure that that space is in an appropriate area and it has an appropriate background for video meetings. Just like we're doing now, Zoom is definitely going to be continually widely used, or at least a platform such as Zoom to continue having video meetings. I am having multiple Zooms a day right now, as I'm sure many of you are as well. So there are just certain things that we want to make sure that in a professional setting, we're not seeing in the background of your video, such as your beds or inside of your closet, dirty dishes in your sink, multiple things. I laugh, but these are all things that people do frequently, and it should be a more appropriate background than if you were just FaceTiming with a friend or a family member. This is still a professional work setting, so we want to make sure that it appears as that way too. And then again, we want to ensure that that environment is also a quiet space and is really distraction free, which I know can be difficult, as I mentioned, if you're working from an area with roommates or with family members, et cetera, in the same space, but really just kind of carving out an area that's yours and yours alone to work in, which is free of some distractions, is really helpful. So here are some examples of what I would call kind of inappropriate backgrounds or video call settings to utilize. We have fortunately had a team member who willingly took some of these shots to kind of show what's not great. So some of you might recognize Crystal, a career consultant from CPDC. But you can kind of take a look at these photos and see, we obviously have the typical somebody who's too close to the screen and it's not an eye exam, we're here for a meeting with you. Or you can see below that we have a light background, which is kind of drowning out. And so her face and appearance is showing up really dark. Other screens of just cutting off your face or lounging on your couch, or we can see into her closet area. So those are just kind of some of the inappropriate backgrounds that we were discussing and things to keep in mind when you're kind of choosing that work area as to where you'll be taking your video calls. So here is a more appropriate video setting. You can see she is completely in the frame from kind of her shoulders and chest up, which is great. We can see her whole face. There's just an appropriate wall in the background with just a decoration or two, which is totally fine. And so this is just a more appropriate setting, nothing in the background that is distracting to an employee or, hard to see her or any of those things. So part of that, you could see in Crystal's pictures that she is also dressing the part. So I know how tempting it can be when you're working from home to just kind of roll out of bed and stick in your pajamas for the day. But you really do want to still stay professional in your dress and appearance. You really want to keep the same dress code that would be expected of you if you were in the office setting. So those are things definitely to address with your manager if they haven't already told you for an internship that you're starting or a full-time role that you're starting. Those are fair questions to ask, kind of what is their typical dress code in the office, and then align your kind of work from home dress code to mirror that as well. I know it's helpful even just waking up and getting myself ready for the day and changing. It still starts to really jumpstart your productivity. It feels more like you are getting ready to go do a job, even if you are just walking across your living room or from your bedroom to your living room or into an office, etc. It still just is important to keep that professional manner and appearance, as you will be undoubtedly having video meetings and things of that. So your coworkers will still inevitably be seeing you as well. So we want to stay showered, we want to stay professional in our appearance and things of that nature. Now Marcy's going to chat with you guys a little bit about different communication that you'll have with employers and team members.
Thanks, Kate. So communication is a super, super important aspect of everything that you'll do as an employee, whether that's full-time or internship. So we're going to break this down into a few different pieces. The first is connecting with your supervisor. Your supervisor may set up regular meetings with you. Those could be daily, weekly, bi-weekly. It really depends on your position and their expectations. If not, it is appropriate for you to request connecting to check in on a regular basis. It's really important that your supervisor understands what you're doing and how you're contributing. So if they haven't set up those meetings, it is 100% okay for you to ask if it's okay if you set up meetings for touch bases, connection points, things like that on a regular or semi-regular basis. Generally speaking, though, you should expect some sort of regular one-on-one check-in meeting with your supervisor or with your manager. Most companies will operate that way, and so that's something that you should expect. In order to prepare for that, you want to keep track of your work status and completed tasks so you can give timely and appropriate updates to your supervisor. You should keep notes regarding your work output and overall productivity. And you should write down questions or topics for your next meeting with your supervisor on an ongoing basis. What you should not do, in our opinion, and Kate knows this well, as do I, is 5 minutes before your meeting with your supervisor, all of a sudden jot down a bunch of things that you want to ask them or things that you want to talk about. You're going to miss things. You're not going to be well prepared. If you keep notes on a regular basis, an ongoing working list, or your company might even request that you prepare a specific agenda for meetings. If so, follow that format. It will help you make sure that you're not missing things and you're including things to show what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you're making contributions to the team, and ask questions along the way that might be important for you to overcome any obstacles or roadblocks you might be facing. So this is a really important aspect, and you want to make sure that as part of your self-management, you're documenting what you're doing to prepare for these meetings and ask for help when you need it. In addition to connecting with your supervisor, it's super important to connect with your team and your coworkers as well. There may be opportunities that are set up for you to do this, especially if you're an intern coming in or a new hire coming in, to connect with individuals, get to know them, meet them, things like that. But there may not be. So if there's not, then we want to seek out those opportunities. But some things to keep in mind overall, that it's great to share ideas and suggestions with your team members, contributing to team meetings, to conversations, things like that, showing that you're listening and that you are a valuable member of the team. Set up meetings with colleagues to ask questions about their areas of expertise and get to know them if those meetings are not set up for you, or to further network and get to know them and progress the relationships forward. Again, we want to manage our daily to-dos and our projects and things like that as a priority first, but this is a great additional add-on. You want to seek out opportunities potentially to volunteer or serve on other project teams of interest. Now, for internships, this may not be something that you're able to do because you might have an assigned project and that's really the bulk of what you'll be contributing. But as a full-time employee, there may be opportunities to do this. It's something you should chat with your supervisor or manager about. If you're interested, make sure they approve. But this could be a way to get to know other people on your team or on other teams as well. And then, of course, if you can, attend virtual team building sessions if those are available, or connection events if those are offered. A lot of companies are doing that now because most people are working remotely currently. And so a way to build connections with new team members, to keep connections with existing team members present, you might see that there's a virtual happy hour or some sort of team building session, or 5 or 10 minutes of a meeting might be dedicated to something fun. Participate in those events and those activities as you can, because that's a really great way for people to get to know you and for you to get to know them. And then one really important piece of communication, especially as it relates to the workplace and our current environment, is technology. So it's really important for you to understand what technology your new company is using and how you are expected to use that technology. So this could be Zoom, it could be Microsoft Teams. There's a variety of virtual products out there. So you should get to know that as part of your onboarding to the organization and understand the expected use of each of those platforms. So along with this, it's also important to learn the communication preferences of your supervisor and coworkers. Some people might prefer email. They might prefer email all the time, or they might prefer email for certain topics. Others might prefer phone, actual phone call from your cell phone or from your company phone through your computer. But they might want you to schedule time and not just call them out of the blue. So it's important for you to understand kind of that preference and what that formality is around that. And the best way to understand that is to simply ask your supervisor, what's the best way for me to contact you if I have questions? If something comes up or I would like to update you on something, do you prefer email? Shall I give you a phone call? Should I set up a meeting for us? All of those things are important for you to know and for you to understand. And asking questions around that is perfectly okay. A lot of companies have instant messaging systems. We have one at CMU. We use it all the time. It's something that's pretty common. A lot of companies do as well, but there's certain topics that we probably wouldn't use, Kate and I, for example, as coworkers, in the instant messaging chat. There's other things that we would use a meeting for instead of a chat. There's certain quick, little, easy things that a chat makes sense for. So understanding that dynamic and if there's a system and what you should be using it for from an instant messaging perspective versus email, again, important to know. Determining the medium of communication based upon the topic is an important aspect to understand virtually for sure as a remote employee, but generally as an employee, as a colleague. More often than not, bigger, more in-depth questions or topics may require a scheduled meeting or something more formal, whereas smaller topics may be best for email or overall kind of general messaging, quick phone calls, things like that, quick chats. That is pretty standard in the workplace, but it's important, again, for you to understand that dynamic. You may have experienced this in your internship or job search already. Big topics, big questions, negotiating, things like that, typically better over the phone with your recruiter. Small, quick updates, small questions, asking for pieces of information, email was easy and the right thing to do. That same kind of logic applies to when you are a full-time employee or an intern. And we can't stress this enough. Make sure you check your emails and messages on a regular basis and respond in a timely manner. Responding to emails day of or even within minutes or hours, depending upon the company, could be the expectation. So it's important for you to understand what the expectation is around getting back to individuals via email or messaging and make sure that you follow that expectation and you're timely in your communication responses as well.
Great, thank you, Marcy. So lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about self-reflection and evaluation because, again, as I said earlier, I think it can be really easy for all of us to just get in the pattern and scheduling out our weeks of just putting our head down and working really hard. And yes, accomplishing a lot of things, but I think it's very important to carve out the time, either if it's on your calendars or even just a reminder on your phone once a month or once a week, whatever it might be, to really reflect on the work that you're doing there and kind of evaluating your skill sets moving forward as well. So we want to do this when you're in an internship just for the summer or when you're in a full-time job or really just throughout your entire career. You inevitably might have to formally evaluate your own performance through an annual review or an end of summer review if it's an internship. But you can also do this just as you go along for yourself. as well. So it's important to reflect on both what you're learning, those skill sets that you're developing, but also on what you're accomplishing on an ongoing basis. I think Marcy mentioned it earlier, even just for keeping an ongoing kind of list to talk about with your manager. But it's important to keep an ongoing list, especially if it's an internship, just for a short amount of time, on what it is that you're working on and what you're accomplishing and different projects that you're a part of and what you've completed, etc. It's also important for a full-time job though, because as I mentioned, most companies in one way or another have some type of review process, whether that's annually or 2 or 3 times a year, maybe it's quarterly, etc. And so this information is going to be really helpful for when you have to write your self-review and then also to have a review meeting with your manager or supervisor. So like I said, it also helps you for kind of learning to prepare how you'll talk about that information in the future. So if it's an internship, that's going to be really, really helpful for what you're going to update your resume at the end of the summer with, and even for a full-time job. Again, you'll want to keep your resume up to date, or if you are a year or 2 from then looking to be promoted or to move into a different role, it will be kind of helpful to see and know what you've accomplished along the way and what type of skill sets that you've developed. So it would be really appropriate to also discuss this progress and your contributions with your manager on an ongoing basis. So during those scheduled kind of one-on-ones or check-in meetings, it is totally okay to discuss kind of your accomplishments and your progress and contributions with that manager. It's also a great way to kind of check in with them to make sure what you would be providing maybe on a resume or in a professional setting is going to be accurate and appropriate so that your supervisor is aware of that work. This can be especially helpful even with internships as well, because let's say you complete a certain amount of projects and you put all of those on your resume, and then in the future you are applying for a different job and they call that company to kind of do a background check to learn more about your internship, or maybe your supervisor is a reference. You would want to make sure that the supervisor was aware of everything that you completed and that you've done, so that none of the contributions that you added to your resume should come as a surprise to your supervisor. So those are just things to keep in mind. Also, I know I have a lot of students that I talk with who at times have to sign NDAs or other kind of disclosure agreements within a company. So sometimes it can be difficult in terms of what they can include on their resume. So those are great things to chat with about your supervisor. Like, how could I depict this on my resume, or kind of pull together a draft and have them verify that it's okay and that you're still staying within those guidelines. So just things to keep in mind. And then, like I said, it's kind of really great for yourself just to consistently really assess your skill sets and assess the gaps that you might have in those skill sets. So what you're trying to develop further and things that you want to work on. Maybe you work on a project initially and you realize, you know what, I don't have a lot of experience with this software program, or with project management or time management even. And those are things that I want to improve upon and get better at. So what are some actual tasks and items that I can do in order to continually improve those skill sets and develop them further? Gaps in your skill sets are totally okay. During those annual reviews or an end of summer review, there's inevitably going to be what are development areas for you. So yes, we'll talk about your wins and your accomplishments, but we'll also talk about what are development areas. So what are those things that you could continue working on and improving on or gaining more experience in? So it's great to look at that. It also is really helpful to see kind of how you want to progress in your career. So you might start in an entry-level role and start taking a look at what the more senior level team members have on their resumes and what are their skill sets. And so what do you kind of need to build upon to one day get there and become more of a senior member of the team? So definitely important part. I think it's one, like I said, that we kind of oftentimes forget, or it kind of becomes secondary and takes a back seat to really just the main projects and day-to-day work that we're doing. But it's really important to carve time out for this kind of self-reflection and evaluation. All right.
And so at this point, oh, go ahead, Kate.
No, that's what I was just going to say. So at this point, we've kind of wrapped up our presentation. so we can go through some questions that you guys may have sent in, or feel free to continue sending in questions to Marcy or I, or to the group overall.
So I did see that we had a couple of questions related to backgrounds, what kind of background is appropriate, or virtual background as well. So we can address that first. Virtual backgrounds can be nice if you don't have something that you feel is appropriate from a background perspective in your own home or apartment or wherever you might be. That being said, my recommendation, and Kate can certainly chime in here, is to avoid the virtual backgrounds simply because they weigh down the bandwidth from a video perspective, and oftentimes can interfere with the audio, or can even cause you to lose connection, or can make it difficult for those that are also on the call, the video call with you. So unless you really need that virtual background, again, to Kate's point earlier, a plain wall, a wall with a picture, you know, a window, as long as it's not interfering with your lighting, things like that are perfectly fine. It does not have to be anything special or fancy. Honestly, a white wall is okay. Again, virtual backgrounds are fine. Don't make them too crazy. They shouldn't be anything that's overly animated or distracting. Again, we still want to be professional, but if you can go without the virtual background, oftentimes that's best, just because it can weigh things down from a bandwidth perspective.
Yeah, I would completely agree. Like Marcy said, if you do have to use one, I would say keep it as simple as possible. I saw somebody asked about a campus background. I know there are some available on the CMU site, even just like the tartan plaid behind you and things that are more simple so they're not too distracting.
Yep. We have another question around just the recording itself. Yes, we're going to be sending out slides, all the slides from the presentation to the attendees later today or early next week. So you'll get that information if you missed anything or want to refer back to anything as well. Another question that we have is in regards to overtime eligibility for international students. So anything related to your work eligibility for anyone that's an international student, we do recommend that you check OIE's website. They are the best resource for that. Generally speaking, overtime policies as well will be dictated by your company. And again, there's a difference between just being eligible for overtime and actually being approved to work overtime. You need supervisor approval. Companies may have policies in place for interns in many cases where they say there will be no overtime for interns. This is your set schedule. You're expected to complete your project work during this set period of time. So that goes back to what we said at the very beginning. It's important to understand company expectations around overtime if you are in fact eligible for it. And if you have any questions about work authorization or your eligibility for certain aspects as far as what hours you can work, things like that, we recommend you check OIE's website because that information is there.
Yes, for sure. And like Marcy said, it's usually always approved. Overtime is approved by a supervisor and kind of dictated by your supervisor. So it doesn't mean that one day you're like, oh, I could keep working on this project for 2 more hours. I'm going to stay and expect to get paid overtime for that. It's usually something that a supervisor, if you are approved for overtime, would come to you and ask, hey, could you add in some extra hours this week and we'll pay you overtime. So all
Exactly.
things to run by your employers.
Any other questions before we wrap up this afternoon? All right, well, we thank you all very much for participating in our session today. We hope this was helpful for you. As always, if you have any specific questions related to your unique situation, you can always reach out to your designated career consultant and ask those questions of your career consultant. We're all more than happy to help you. And again, we hope that this was helpful to you. If you have any questions related to work authorization, social security numbers, paperwork processing, things like that, the Office of International Education has all of that information on their website, and that is your best resource as well. Otherwise, again, we're thankful that you participated. We hope that you all have a very positive experience at your internship.